After my husband passed not long ago, my daughter-in-law laughed in my face and jabbed her finger toward me, saying, "The mansion is too small now. The old and useless should move out." The grand hall of our $30 million mansion still smelled of wine and echoed with the faint music of the party that had just ended. Guests froze mid-step as if the air itself had turned to glass. My hand clutched the crystal glass so tightly my knuckles turned white, yet her voice cut through me like a whip. My own daughter-in-law, standing tall in her sequined gown, eyes blazing with cruel delight, had just stripped me of my place in front of everyone. I felt the blood drain from my face as my son sat beside her, silent, his jaw tight but his lips sealed. Cowardice radiated from him like poison. She leaned closer, smirking, her words dripping venom as she whispered loud enough for the crowd to hear that old women clinging to mansions were nothing but parasites. Laughter broke from a few corners, nervous, guilty, yet it stabbed deeper. My throat burned, my chest tightened, and the world swayed around me. The glass slid from my fingers and shattered on the marble floor, the crack echoing like thunder, shards scattering like sparks of humiliation. Gasps rippled through the hall, and I saw eyes widen, some pitying, most entertained. She tilted her chin high, basking in her performance, savoring my collapse as if it were dessert. I wanted to scream, to strike, but all I could do was stand trembling, fighting against the wave of shame that threatened to drown me. I thought of my husband, of the vows we made to protect this family, and felt the cruel irony that his widow now stood mocked like a beggar in her own home. My daughter-in-law raised her glass again, her laugh sharp as broken crystal, and in that moment I knew she wanted me destroyed, erased, forgotten. All eyes turned to my son, waiting for him to defend me, to stand as the man his father once raised. For a moment his lips parted as if he might speak, but instead he pulled out his phone, his face carved in stone. In that charged silence his voice was steady, detached, as he told someone at a nursing home that a new resident would be arriving soon. My knees weakened as if the marble beneath me had given way. The words struck harder than any blow, because they carried the weight of premeditation, as if this betrayal had been planned long before tonight. Gasps rippled through the hall, and a few guests lowered their glasses, shifting uneasily, while others fixed their eyes on the chandeliers above, pretending not to witness my humiliation. The laughter that had filled this hall earlier now died, leaving only the sound of my son's calm voice arranging my exile. My throat burned with unshed tears, yet I forced myself not to plead, not to beg, for that would have given them satisfaction. I thought of the years I spent building this home with his father, of the sacrifices I made so he could grow into a man, only to be discarded like a relic that no longer served its purpose. Shame clung to me like a second skin, raw and suffocating. Around me the guests shuffled, caught between pity and fear, not daring to interfere lest they lose their standing with the family. I stood in that grand hall, a mother branded a burden, stripped of dignity in the very mansion I had helped create, and though my body trembled, a spark inside me refused to die. They thought I was a shadow, a burden to discard, yet every stone, every light above their heads exists because of me, and soon they will learn that this house has never truly belonged to them. The sting of shame scorched my skin, each whisper in the room slicing me deeper, as though I were stripped naked before them all. My heart pounded with humiliation so heavy it threatened to crush me, yet beneath that weight a different fire stirred. I kept my eyes lowered, letting them believe I was defeated, letting them savor their shallow triumph. But inside my chest, memories of contracts signed, trusts sealed, and deeds secured pulsed like hidden armor. They thought tonight marked my fall, but what truly began was their undoing. I stood in silence, a widow mocked and discarded, but within the silence I held a secret sharper than their cruelty. I shut my eyes, and the sting of shame slipped into memory, back to the years when everything began with nothing but grit and hope. I was in my early 20s when my husband and I opened a tiny sewing shop on a quiet street. It was no palace, only 4 cramped walls filled with the smell of fabric and the hum of old machines. But to us, it was a kingdom. We worked late into the night, our fingers pricked by needles, our backs sore from bending over the tables, and still I felt proud, certain that every ache was proof of a life we were building together. He was the center of my world, steady in his words and fierce in his dreams. I trusted him completely, never questioning, always believing his vision would carry us through. I managed the books, scrubbed the floors, greeted customers, and stitched beside him, carrying the weight of business and home without complaint. Each dress finished, each suit delivered brought a small cheer to our hearts, a reminder that effort was paying off. We laughed even when money was scarce, shared bowls of soup as if they were feasts, and promised each other that fortune was waiting somewhere ahead. Years rolled by, and that modest shop slowly grew into a real company with offices of glass and steel, contracts with names I had once only read about. Through all of it, my devotion never faltered. I saw his dream as my own heartbeat, steady and unshakable. Never once did I imagine that the empire we had built from bare hands could be turned against me, that the mansion of crystal and marble born from our sweat would one day host the cruel betrayal I faced now. The bitter truth crept into my life like a shadow I had tried to ignore for too long. For years of marriage, despite our love and struggles, there were no children of our own. Whenever I raised the subject, my husband brushed it aside with excuses of work, of exhaustion, of duties too heavy to allow for tenderness. At first I believed him, trusting as I always did, telling myself that fate simply had other plans for us. Then one evening he returned with a boy no more than 5, his eyes dark and watchful, and announced that he was an adopted child who needed a home. He placed the boy's hand in mine and commanded me to treat him as if he were my own flesh and blood. I smiled, swallowed my doubts, and opened my heart to the child, believing it to be a blessing in disguise. I nursed him through fevers, taught him to read, mended his clothes with the same devotion I would have given any son of my body. Yet as years passed, whispers reached me, hushed voices in corridors, papers tucked away too carefully, and glances exchanged that pierced my trust. One night, a document slipped from his briefcase, a certificate with the boy's name and his bloodline revealed. The truth struck me cold. This was not adoption. This was the living proof of my husband's betrayal, the child of his affair brought under my roof, handed to me as a duty. My hands trembled, yet I pressed the paper against my chest, torn between the love I had given and the lies I had been forced to live. The shock of discovering the truth never left me, but I learned to hide it behind a calm smile. Outwardly, I remained the obedient wife, the steady partner who supported her husband without question. Inwardly, I began to prepare my own path, one no one else could touch. Quietly, I set up a private investment fund in my name alone, tucked away under careful legal structures that even he did not see. Each month, while the company grew and demanded more capital, I slipped in funds from my side, disguising them as routine business transactions. No one asked where the lifeline came from. They only saw the company revived when cash flow thinned. I became the unseen blood running through its veins, the steady current that kept doors open, salaries paid, contracts fulfilled. My husband praised the resilience of his empire without realizing I was the one stitching the wounds he never acknowledged. At night, I would review ledgers in silence, running my finger across numbers that told a story only I understood. It was a secret armor, a shield I built quietly, not from revenge at first, but from the instinct to survive. Yet deep inside, I knew the day would come when the hidden foundation I had laid would prove stronger than his pride. And on that day, the house he thought was his would stand on the pillars I alone had forged. To them, I was nothing more than the quiet wife who endured, the woman who kept to the shadows while men made the decisions. My husband and even the boy I raised believed I lived off their power, that my role was to smile, to serve, to accept whatever place they granted me. They never once suspected that behind the calm mask I wore, I held the strings of survival itself. Each account I funded, each debt I covered, each silent transfer placed the company in my palm. Without my support, their empire would have collapsed years ago, yet they carried on with the illusion that I was dependent. My husband, in particular, grew drunk on wealth, buying a $30 million mansion and parading it as proof of his success, though the deed was not in his own name but in the company's. He believed it untouchable, another jewel to showcase his grandeur, never realizing that the financial blood running through the company was mine. At dinners, he would boast of his brilliance, guests nodding in awe while I poured wine and lowered my gaze, letting him have his stage. I listened quietly, storing each word, each arrogance, each misstep, while in my mind I saw the balance sheets that told another story. I knew exactly how fragile his foundation was, and I alone carried the key to its stability. They saw a submissive woman, patient and soft, but beneath that mask lived a strategist waiting for the moment when truth would serve as weapon, when the silence I had worn for decades would shatter into power they could no longer deny. After his father's death, the boy who was never truly mine received 20% of the company shares. He held the documents as though they were a crown, his chest puffed with pride, his voice suddenly sharper and louder in boardrooms. He strutted through the office hallways as if every desk, every employee, every corner of the company now bowed to him. To our business partners, he boasted that he was the new master, the heir destined to lead, and many nodded politely, though I could see the doubt flicker in their eyes. He mistook courtesy for loyalty, applause for respect, and believed his small slice of the pie gave him dominion over the whole feast. I watched him from the shadows, silent as always, letting him drown in his own arrogance. He dismissed my presence at meetings, laughed at my caution, and spoke of expansion plans that reeked of recklessness. The young women at his side whispered admiration, fanning the flames of his vanity, while he waved contracts as trophies. I kept my gaze lowered, my notes neat, though inside I recorded each misstep like stitches on a hidden ledger. 20% gave him a voice, yes, but not the power he imagined, for the lifeblood of the company did not flow through his veins. It flowed through mine, and while he danced on illusions of power, I quietly prepared the ground where his pride would collapse, knowing that arrogance was always the first seed of downfall. They no longer even tried to hide their contempt. My stepson and his wife spoke down to me in front of the servants, their voices sharp, their laughter cutting, as if humiliating me had become their entertainment. I endured the stares of the staff, some pitying, some avoiding my eyes, as his wife mocked the way I dressed, the way I walked, the way I breathed in what she now called her mansion. But the deepest wound came the day they brought another woman through the iron gates, a woman I had never expected to see cross the threshold. She was his real mother, the one my husband had betrayed me with, and they welcomed her into the marble halls as though she were the rightful lady of the house. I stood in silence, the walls closing in, as if every chandelier and every stone mocked me for believing this home was mine. Soon after, I was told with cold civility that my room was no longer mine, that space was needed for their family, and I should consider moving elsewhere. It was not a request, but a decree. I packed my belongings slowly, each dress folded with trembling hands, each memory pressing into me like a blade. To be cast out from the house I had helped build, from the legacy I had poured my soul into, was a cruelty sharper than death. Yet even as I walked out under the heavy gates, I felt something stir within me. Not the end, but the beginning of a reckoning. I did not argue, nor did I beg. With my head lowered and my steps measured, I walked out as though I truly were the discarded relic they believed me to be. The gates closed behind me with a sound that echoed like final judgment, and to the world it appeared that I had surrendered, a cast-off widow pushed aside by those younger and stronger. Yet inside me, silence was only a mask. For years I had lived in the shadows, weaving a plan thread by thread, building a fortress no one could see. The private fund I had hidden away, the quiet streams of capital I had poured into the company, all of it waited like dormant fire. As they toasted their triumph in the marble halls, I sat in the quiet of a rented apartment, opening ledgers and documents that bore my name alone. Numbers danced before me, proof that while they held the stage, I still held the lifeblood that kept their empire alive. My hands no longer trembled, my eyes no longer wept. They thought exile had broken me, but in truth it had set me free to act without disguise. What they saw as defeat was only the moment I released the weight of pretense, and with it, I triggered the reckoning I had been preparing for decades. Only a few weeks after they seized the company and cast me out, the storm they never expected began to break. My son, so proud of his new title, was the first to receive the warnings. Payroll was delayed, and anxious employees whispered in hallways about missed checks. Suppliers, once eager to do business, now sent sharp letters demanding payment, threatening lawsuits that could tarnish the company's name. The phones in his office rang without pause, every call a reminder that the lifeline he thought endless had suddenly dried up. At night, bank notices piled on his desk, cold words stamped in red, demanding immediate repayment of loans he had assumed were secure. His wife tried to calm him, telling him it was a passing crisis, yet I knew the truth. Those streams of capital that had always appeared just in time, those silent rescues that kept the wheels turning, were gone because I had withdrawn them. The empire he flaunted was built on invisible veins I alone supplied, and without them, it bled out faster than he could grasp. Behind closed doors, he shouted at managers, slammed his fists on polished tables, but rage could not summon money from air. The same marble halls where he once boasted now echoed with fear, and already the scent of failure lingered in every corner. He tore through the files in his office, desperate for answers, until the truth struck him like a blade. For years, the company had not survived on profits as he proudly believed. The balance sheets revealed something far more unsettling, a steady stream of capital arriving quarter after quarter from a source labeled only as an anonymous fund. At board meetings, they had always called it their angel investor, the mysterious benefactor who appeared to keep the company alive during its hardest seasons. My son had grown up believing this myth, using it as proof of his father's genius, and now his own. But as he traced the transfers, his face paled, sweat beading on his forehead. The records showed precision, discipline, and timing too exact to be chance. It dawned on him that the empire he boasted about was never built on his father's brilliance, nor on his own merit, but on the unseen hand of the woman he had just cast aside. A cold vertigo washed over him as the realization settled, and for a moment he could not remember how to breathe. Every light in the mansion, every contract signed, every luxury flaunted was paid for by the secret fund I controlled in silence. Rage and disbelief battled in his eyes as he realized the very person he mocked as useless had been the one feeding the company its lifeblood. He slammed the ledger shut, but the truth echoed louder than his fury. His power had always been an illusion, and the ground beneath him was not his to stand on. In that silence he felt the slow, cruel unmaking of his reputation, as if a mask had been ripped from his face before the whole town. The moment they cast me out, I made the call I had rehearsed in my mind for years. My instructions were simple, precise, and final. Every dollar of the private fund that had sustained their empire was pulled back under my control. Accounts that had once quietly fed their payroll and soothed their creditors now closed like iron doors. At first, my son and his wife dismissed the sudden drought as a passing delay. They promised their staff that payments would be processed soon, that suppliers would not wait long, that banks would surely grant them leniency. But days turned into weeks, and the truth became impossible to deny. The company that had paraded itself as invincible began to choke without the silent lifeline I had always provided. Emails went unanswered, whispered meetings multiplied, and the air in the offices grew thick with a fear that had nowhere to hide. Salaries went unpaid, workers muttered in corners, resentment spread like a fever through the offices. The marble floors and glass walls could no longer hide the growing cracks in the foundation. Calls from vendors grew sharper, threatening lawsuits, and shipments stalled at docks because bills had not been cleared. Banks, sensing weakness, moved swiftly, demanding repayment of loans with interest, issuing warnings stamped in red that piled higher every morning on his desk. In desperation, he tried to negotiate, selling promises and charm, but numbers refused to bend to arrogance. I imagined him pacing the boardroom, fists pounding the polished table, eyes wild as he realized the illusion of control was slipping from his hands. For all his boasting, he had never understood that a company without liquidity is a body without blood. I had been that blood. Now the corridors that once hummed with confident orders filled with the hollow echoes of uncertainty, and every confident proclamation dissolved under the weight of bounced checks and frozen credit lines. And now, without me, the body lay dying. What they had thought was power was only dependency dressed in fine suits, and the moment I withdrew, their empire collapsed into dust. When the banks tightened their grip and the mansion was listed for sale to cover the debts, I did not weep as they expected. Instead, I sat in silence with my trusted lawyer, reviewing the documents line by line. We arranged everything through a shell company, a name that meant nothing to the world but served as the mask for my return. The purchase was swift, discreet, and executed with the precision of a blade. While my son and his wife scrambled to explain to society why their grand home had been seized, I quietly reclaimed what was mine. On paper, the buyer appeared to be a modest investment group, an entity with no ties to me, just another faceless corporation in a crowded market. No gossip column, no curious relative, no prying business partner could connect the dots. Yet behind the ink, behind the seals and signatures, I stood as the true owner. The marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the gardens that once bloomed under my care were again secured, though no one in the world knew it. I let them continue their charade, speaking of rebuilding, of starting over, never realizing that the very roof over their heads now belonged to the woman they had cast out. My son and his wife walked out of the bank with forced smiles, convinced they had pulled the company back from the edge. They told anyone who would listen that selling the mansion had been a smart, strategic move, proof of their leadership in crisis. At dinner parties, they raised glasses and laughed, boasting that sacrifice was temporary and fortune would soon return. They paraded around in designer clothes, their voices full of pride, speaking as if they still held wealth in their hands. In truth, the money from the sale had never touched their pockets. Every cent had gone straight into the hungry jaws of the bank, swallowed to cover debts they could no longer control. Yet they carried on in blissful ignorance, dreaming of expansion, drafting plans on paper that would never come alive. Behind their laughter, the truth stood quietly. The mansion was no longer theirs, no longer a trophy of power, but now mine again through the shell company that shielded my name. They walked past the iron gates believing they had simply traded property for freedom, not realizing that the very home they once flaunted had already slipped into my hands. Their arrogance blinded them, and they lived in an illusion, celebrating a victory that had never existed. While they lived in their illusion, I moved quietly in the background, one step at a time. I began reaching out to the smaller shareholders, men and women who had once praised my husband but now trembled at the company's decline. Over tea in quiet cafes or in the privacy of their own homes, I listened to their fears, their doubts, the panic in their voices as they spoke of unpaid dividends and contracts falling apart. I did not push. I simply offered them a way out, a chance to unburden themselves from a sinking ship. One by one they agreed, handing over their shares for a fair price, relieved to escape before the wreck pulled them under. On paper, the transfers looked harmless, the shares absorbed by an investment entity with no familiar name. In reality, every signature brought another piece of the company back into my hands. My son still strutted through the boardroom, speaking as though his 20% gave him absolute command, never suspecting that the foundation beneath him was shifting. Each day my influence grew, subtle but steady, and I regained the voice they thought had been silenced. No one applauded, no one noticed, but power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it gathers like a storm behind the horizon, unseen until the first thunder shakes the ground. The trap closed not with noise but with silence, each thread tightening exactly as I had planned. The company bled from every corner, its credit drained, its reputation shaken, its partners turning away. What my son once flaunted as an empire was now a hollow shell, starving without the lifeline I had always given. The mansion, their proud symbol of triumph, no longer belonged to them, though they still paraded past its gates in denial, unaware that the true deed rested in my hands. The very stone lions at the entrance seemed to mock them now, guardians of a kingdom already lost. At night, their laughter rang out, forced and brittle, as they convinced themselves they still held power. Yet beneath the surface, their foundation was gone. The banks had no patience left, the staff whispered of leaving, and suppliers demanded payment in cash they no longer had. I watched from a distance, not with joy but with cold clarity, as each piece fell into place. They thought I was exiled, defeated, erased. In truth, every move they made had only drawn them deeper into the web I had spun long before their arrogance took root. Now they stood suspended, clinging to illusions, not realizing the walls around them were closing. The irony was that their downfall was not a thunderclap, but a slow drowning, each day another breath stolen until there was none left. Their downfall was not sudden but certain, and every step they took, believing in victory, was in fact another step into my carefully woven net. The morning began with silence, broken only by the sound of the courier at their gate. A thick envelope was placed on the table, its weight heavy with the kind of news that could shatter illusions. My son tore it open with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the first page, then widening in disbelief. It was a lease agreement, cold and clear, stating that if they wished to remain in the mansion, they would now be tenants, bound to pay a rent that soared into hundreds of thousands of dollars each month. The ink itself seemed to sneer, black strokes announcing their servitude where once they had claimed sovereignty. His wife gasped, clutching the paper as if her grip could change the numbers printed in bold. She demanded to know who dared impose such terms, but no answer came, only the silent authority of ink and seal. His mother, who had been lounging in the living room in a velvet chair, sank lower, the branded dress she had been admiring still dangling with its uncut tag. The daughter-in-law turned on her, shouting that her extravagance had drained them, that she was nothing but dead weight. The older woman snapped back, her voice shrill, accusing the young wife of arrogance and waste. Their words clashed in the air, bitter and sharp, the fragile unity between them crumbling. Meanwhile my son sat frozen, his fingers trembling as he turned each page, the clauses spelling out their helplessness. Every line reminded him that the house he had called his kingdom was no longer his. Sweat dampened his collar, his mouth dry as stone, while the argument of the two women rose around him like a storm. For the first time, he felt the ground shifting completely beyond his control. Panic spread through the mansion like smoke from an unseen fire. They huddled around the speakerphone, voices sharp and frantic, demanding answers from the lawyer they believed would save them. But his tone was calm, almost detached, as he explained that the sale of the property had been carried out legally, with every document in order, and that they had no claim to remain without paying rent. His words were not simply legal statements, but the tolling of a bell, final and merciless. My daughter-in-law broke down, her sobs echoing through the grand hall. She cried out that the house had been left by my husband, that it was their inheritance, that no one could take it from them. The lawyer paused before replying, and when he did, his words cut deeper than any insult. The property had not been willed to them as individuals, he said, but tied to the company, and once debts consumed the company, the mansion was seized and sold. Nothing remained in their name. My son sat with his face pale, gripping his hair, rocking slightly as if the motion could block out the truth. His mother muttered curses under her breath, blaming everyone but herself, while his wife collapsed against the sofa, mascara streaking her face. The servants lingered at the edge of the room, watching silently, their loyalty already shifting. The empire, once a glittering stage for their vanity, had become a theater of ruin, and the applause they craved had turned into whispers of pity. The empire they had flaunted was unraveling strand by strand, and for the first time, the walls of marble and glass felt like a cage. The phone rang again, this time not with lawyers but with frantic calls from the company office. My son answered with a shaky voice, only to hear his managers reporting disaster after disaster. Employees were walking out in groups, demanding wages that could not be paid. Desks stood empty, projects abandoned. The once bustling corridors now silent except for the echo of doors slamming shut. Suppliers had begun pulling their contracts one after another, unwilling to gamble on promises that no longer meant anything. Even long-standing partners who had once toasted with them at galas now sent curt notices of termination, severing ties to protect themselves. And above it all, the banks tightened their grip, slashing credit lines, refusing extensions, demanding repayment that was impossible. His wife clutched his arm, whispering that something had to be done, but her voice cracked with fear. His mother sat hunched, muttering about betrayal, still blind to the truth that the betrayal had been their own arrogance. Phone after phone clicked off as each manager gave up, voices becoming thin with exhaustion, and a single recurring question haunted every call. Where would the money come from now? My son's hands shook as he dropped the receiver back into its cradle, staring blankly at the wall as if it could offer answers. The weight of it all pressed down at once. The mansion was gone, the money was gone, and now the company was collapsing before his eyes. There was nothing left to hold them up. They waited in the conference room, shoulders hunched, eyes red from sleepless nights. The air was thick with desperation as my son fumbled with his tie, his wife clutching his sleeve, and his mother shifting nervously in her chair. They had begged for this meeting with the mysterious new owner, hoping for mercy, praying for some miracle that might allow them to stay in the mansion or salvage the company. When the heavy doors finally opened, the sound of heels striking the polished floor echoed like a drumbeat. A hush fell so complete that even the hum of the air conditioning seemed sacrilegious, as if the room itself were holding its breath. I stepped inside, dressed in a tailored suit of quiet elegance, pearls resting lightly at my throat, my gaze calm and unwavering. For a moment no one moved. The silence wrapped around them as realization dawned. My son's mouth fell open, his face draining of color. His wife gasped, clutching her chest, as if she had seen a ghost. His mother dropped the scarf she had been fidgeting with, her hands trembling. I stood at the head of the table, laying a folder down with measured grace, and allowed the truth to sink in. I was the owner they had begged to meet. The mansion, the contracts, the very company they had thought theirs, all were under my control now. The folder I set down carried seals, wire transfer confirmations, and notarized deeds that left no room for argument. The weight of years of mockery, betrayal, and arrogance pressed into the stillness. My son tried to speak, his voice cracking, but no words came. His wife whispered frantically that this must be a mistake, that it could not be real, yet the document spoke louder than any denial. I met their eyes, not with anger but with the serenity of one who no longer needed to fight. There was no gloating in my silence, only the quiet satisfaction of a long, deliberate reckoning. The trap had closed. What they thought was their kingdom had always rested in my hands. I stood at the head of the long table, letting the silence press against them before I spoke. My son, his wife, his mother, and the remaining shareholders stared at me as if I were a stranger. I breathed slowly, savoring the weight of the moment, then let my words fall sharp and unrelenting. You have lived on my money your entire lives. You called me useless. You mocked me in my own home. And now it is time to pay the price. My son's face went pale, his mouth opening but no sound coming. His wife clung to his arm, whispering frantic protests, while his mother hunched lower in her chair, her hands shaking. The shareholders exchanged uneasy glances, realizing with dawning clarity that everything they believed had been built on my strength, not his. I opened a folder and slid papers across the polished surface. Each document showed the same truth. Every payroll rescue, Every supplier contract, every debt quietly settled, had come from the secret fund I controlled. Without me, there would have been no company, no mansion, no empire. You thought yourselves rulers, I continued, but you were parasites feeding on my sacrifices. The room shifted, whispers rising like restless wind. My son finally forced words from his lips, begging for understanding, but his voice cracked with weakness. His wife burst into tears, covering her face, her sobs echoing against marble walls. His mother muttered curses under her breath, still unwilling to face the truth. I leaned forward, my voice calm but final. From this day forward, the company is mine. The mansion is mine. Your fortune is gone. What remains for you is debt, disgrace, and the memory of what you wasted. The silence that followed was heavy as stone. I closed the folder with a quiet snap, stood tall, and let the weight of the new order sink in. They had thought I was powerless. Now they understood that every thread of power had always been in my hands. Dot. The fall was brutal, stripping away every illusion my son had wrapped around himself, and the emptiness settled like a weight. It arrived like frost, leaving little standing. Only months before, he had walked through the marble halls of the mansion with his chin high, boasting to guests that he was the heir, the rightful master of an empire. He used to move as if the world cleared a path for him, every nod and toast confirming his imagined dominion. Now he sat alone in a small rented apartment with peeling paint, staring at papers that no longer meant anything. The shares he once held with such pride had collapsed into worthlessness, nothing more than ash after the company declared bankruptcy. Judges and creditors had carved through the remains, leaving him no power, no position, not even a title to cling to. The mansion, the $30 million jewel he flaunted as his legacy, had already been sold under the bank's order and silently reclaimed through my shell company. Its rooms had been repopulated by strangers, the portraits replaced, and the hush of new ownership hung heavy in the halls. On the outside, society whispered about unfortunate luck, about a careless heir undone by bad timing. But he knew better. He knew the house no longer sheltered him, that it had returned to the woman he had cast aside. He tried to shout at lawyers, demanded answers, but their replies were empty and cold. To them, he was just another debtor. His wife grew bitter. Her beauty sharpened into venom as she hurled accusations, calling him a failure, screaming that she had married into ashes. She raged at the unfairness as if fury could knit their fortunes back together. His mother sat in silence most days, clutching old dresses as if fabric could comfort her, her tears staining velvet sleeves. The servants had long gone, their wages unpaid, their loyalty dissolved. The so-called friends who once filled their parties stopped answering calls. Invitations vanished. Even the chauffeurs who once bowed at the door refused to return. He looked into the mirror and barely recognized himself. The man who believed he was a master now resembled a shadow, hollow-eyed and trembling, stripped of dignity. He learned painfully how quickly status could vanish. He wandered through the days with no work to anchor him, no house to call his own, no wealth to display. For the first time in his life, he saw the truth clearly. Everything he had claimed as his was never his at all. It had been built, sustained, and protected by the woman he had mocked as useless. And now, with nothing left, he was forced to taste the bitter truth of being truly powerless. For the daughter-in-law and her mother, the fall was as sharp as it was public. Only months earlier, they had swept through charity galas and luxury luncheons in gowns that sparkled under chandeliers, smiling with the smug confidence of women who believed fortune would always bow to them. Now their phones lay silent, invitations vanished, and the friends who once flattered them crossed the street to avoid a greeting. In the boutiques where they had once been welcomed with champagne, saleswomen whispered behind their hands, smirking at the gossip that traveled faster than fire. At restaurants, heads turned when they entered, but not in admiration, only in scorn. Whispers of greed, deceit, and betrayal followed them like shadows, a chorus reminding everyone of how ruthlessly they had mocked the very woman who had built their wealth. The high society circles that had once applauded their extravagance now treated them like contagion, stepping back as though fear of disgrace were catching. The daughter-in-law clutched her designer bag as though it might shield her, but even that no longer carried weight. The labels looked pitiful on a woman whose bills went unpaid. Her mother, once proud to pose at her side, now shrank in corners, her painted smile unable to disguise the trembling in her hands. Every glance in public was a dagger, every whisper a verdict. Their kingdom of mirrors had shattered, and they stood exposed, stripped of illusions, left with nothing but shame. The scandal reached its peak when the headlines screamed across every major paper: Heir discovers $30 million mansion was never his, liquidated as corporate debt. The words were brutal, stamped in bold black ink, impossible to ignore at newsstands and glowing on digital screens. Below them, photographs showed my son, shoulders hunched, face hidden behind his hand as he left the courthouse, and later as he stood outside the company's glass tower, head bowed like a defeated man. The images spread faster than wildfire, carried from front pages to television screens, replayed in endless loops that stripped him of whatever dignity he still tried to claim. People in cafes laughed bitterly over the story, shaking their heads at the arrogance that had brought him low. Commentators on evening news programs dissected every misstep, holding him up as the perfect cautionary tale of greed, entitlement, and blindness. To the public, he was no longer an heir, but a fool who destroyed his own fortune. Strangers spoke of him as if he were a character in a tragedy, one who had written his downfall with his own hand. His wife and mother shrank from the spotlight, their names dragged into the same ridicule, while I remained unseen, my role invisible to the crowd. What the world saw was the collapse of a man who had mocked his own blood, a warning carved into print that greed always devours itself. The story closed not with thunder, but with quiet. I sat in the study of the mansion, now mine again though stripped of its past illusions, and let the stillness speak louder than any triumph. Outside, the gardens stretched wide, roses blooming as if untouched by betrayal, their fragrance unbothered by the wreckage of human greed. I thought of the faces that once filled these halls with arrogance and laughter, of the voices that had mocked me, calling me old and useless, and of the silence that now replaced them. The empire they built on lies had crumbled, and I remained. Yet victory felt heavier than I had expected. The rooms echoed differently. The chandeliers glittered, but not with joy, only with memory. I asked myself the question that lingers for anyone who has endured betrayal and then prevailed. Was this true happiness? Or was it simply the satisfaction of survival, the cold comfort of knowing that justice had been restored? My son was gone from my side, his choices pulling him into ruin. My daughter-in-law and his mother lived in disgrace, their names spat out in whispers. Society moved on, already looking for the next scandal, while I was left with the truth I had carried all along. Wealth and power can be stolen, twisted, or destroyed, but dignity, once protected, remains unbroken. Perhaps that is the deeper inheritance, not measured in dollars or deeds, but in the resilience to stand tall when others try to crush you. The mansion, the company, the fortune, these are symbols, but they are not the essence. What endures is the clarity to see through deception, the strength to guard one's integrity, and the wisdom that age grants when youth mistakes arrogance for power. So I leave the question with you, the witness to this tale. Does victory truly equal happiness, or is happiness found in preserving dignity even when the world calls you defeated? What is the true legacy, wealth, or the honor of holding firm to what cannot be taken? If this story reminds you that the wisdom of age is something no one can steal, then share it, so others remember that justice, though it may walk slowly, always finds its way home.